The Atlanta campaign. The severest campaign this Army ever had. August 23rd, 1864, after the Battle of Atlanta. For a long time during the summer of 1864, President Lincoln had been hearing reports from the states, from political friends, from newspapermen, that the political prospects for the Republicans in 1864 were getting worse and worse and worse. Of course, 1864 was a presidential election year. And by mid to late August, Lincoln was pretty convinced that the Republicans would not win the November election. And so he wrote what became known as the Blind Memo. It was a memo in his own handwriting that he wrote and presented to his cabinet on August 23rd, 1864. But the reason it's called the Blind Memo is he didn't let them see it. He wrote it on a piece of paper, he folded the paper over, he put it on the desk, he said, I want you all to sign this. And they all signed it. And they, had no idea what they had just signed. And he put it in a desk drawer. He had a habit of doing that. A lot of things ended up in a desk drawer for use later on. So he put it in a desk drawer. It never emerged during his presidency. It was gathered up with all his papers, and people found out much later, including all those cabinet members, what it was that the Blind Memo said and what they had signed. What the memo said was, this morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and his inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. So he was committing himself and his cabinet to doing whatever they could do in the interim between the election day in November and March 4th, 1865, when he expected a new president to be inaugurated, to make sure that the two goals that they had, that the Union would be preserved and slavery would be abandoned, happened in that very short, brief period of time, because he was sure that it could not happen after the inauguration. So let's go back and see how Lincoln got to this very sad place. There was reason for optimism in the spring of 1864. The disheartening string of Union defeats, while not ended, was at least interrupted with important major victories at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga in 1863. Lincoln fired some more generals and elevated U.S. Grant to the post of General-in-Chief of the Union Army. Finally, people thought, the Army has a general who would fight. They expected a quick and decisive campaign as soon as the weather permitted. Grant assigned William Tecumseh Sherman, then commander of the Army of the Tennessee, to lead the military division of the Mississippi, which is Grant's old unit. His assignment was to move against General Joseph E. Johnston's Army of Tennessee, break it up, and get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can against their war resources. The military division of the Mississippi consisted of 3 veteran units. The Army of the Cumberland, led by George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, was by far the largest and best equipped. John M. Schofield, commander of the Army of the Ohio, was the youngest of Sherman's 3 commanding officers and had the least combat experience. He also led the smallest army, which was just the size of a large division. When Sherman took command of the military district of the Mississippi, his post as commander of the Army of the Tennessee went to James B. McPherson. McPherson had very little combat leadership experience, but he had Sherman's respect and trust. The Army of the Tennessee was not large, but it was very nimble, and Sherman counted on them more than any other unit during the Atlanta campaign. Before we move on, a word about naming armies. The military division of the Mississippi is named for the Mississippi River. All the armies in Sherman's command, the Army of the Cumberland, the Ohio, and the Tennessee, are named for those rivers. Southern armies were named for locations, like the Army of Northern Virginia, and Johnston's army, which is the Army of Tennessee. So, listen carefully for the word "the" as we go along, because that's the difference between the Northerners and the Southerners. The political leaders and military leaders in Richmond knew that 1864 was a presidential election year and Lincoln was confronting mounting war weariness. They also knew that the Confederate armies were never going to be any larger. Virtually every available man in the South was serving or had been killed or injured. The armies were tough, experienced, and generally well led, but realistically they could not be expected to hold off Union forces indefinitely. If they could hold the Union armies at bay through October, the Democrats in the North could easily win the presidential election and sue for peace. A stalemate through the summer could mean an end to the war on the South's terms, recognition of the Confederate States of America, and the continuation of slavery. Joseph E. Johnston took command of the Army of Tennessee from Braxton Bragg after the debacle at Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge at the end of 1863. He was not a favorite of President Jefferson Davis, who thought he was too cautious. At one point during the Atlanta campaign, Johnston told Davis, "As the enemy has double our numbers, we must be on the defensive. My plan of operation must therefore depend on that of the enemy. It is mainly to wait for an opportunity to fight to advantage." Symbolically and strategically, Atlanta was the prize one side sought to occupy and the other side needed to protect. 4 rail lines met at Atlanta. Almost due east was the Georgia Railroad, which connected the city to eastern ports and to Richmond. In a generally southern direction, the Macon and Western connected to the central of Georgia and to Savannah. Branching off from the Macon and Western at East Point was the Atlanta and West Point Railroad that led to Alabama and to Mobile Bay. Heading northwest was the Western and Atlantic to Chattanooga and to central Tennessee. Because of the railroads, the Confederate government had made Atlanta its main industrial, logistical, and administrative base in what was geographically the South, but militarily the West. There was an arsenal in the city that produced cartridges, shells, friction primers, gun carriages, knapsacks, and saddles. In a former grist mill, 300 workers, many of them women, made pistols. There were 2 foundries and a rolling mill for manufacturing cannons, armor plate, and rails. Smaller plants produced everything from rifles to belt buckles. Food was processed at flour mills and packing plants. The city housed 6 military hospitals. All the rail lines met at the car shed, a long brick depot at the center of the city. The car shed was surrounded by roundhouses, spur lines, maintenance facilities, marshaling yards, and warehouses. Nearby, at the 5 points, were the headquarters of the Confederate quartermaster, commissary, ordnance, engineer, payroll, provost marshal, conscript, medical, niter and mining, and naval departments for the Western theater of the war. Logistics and supply were all concentrated in the city. All through the spring, Sherman worked to solve what he called the most difficult of my problems: provisions. What Sherman wanted was enough food, forage, ammunition, and other necessities to maintain 100,000 soldiers and 35,000 horses and mules for 70 days. To achieve this, he had to ensure that there would be no break in the railroad line from Chattanooga, where the troops and supplies were being marshaled, to Nashville, which one quartermaster officer described as the biggest army depot today on the face of the earth. Of course, the line from Louisville, Kentucky to Nashville needed to be equally secure. The main threat to Sherman's supply line was Nathan Bedford Forrest, considered by some to be the Civil War's best cavalry officer. Sherman dispatched Cavalry Brigadier General Samuel E. Sturgis from Memphis to attack Forrest wherever he may be. Forrest, meanwhile, wrote to General Johnston at Dalton, Georgia, "I am of the opinion that everything available is being concentrated against General Lee and yourself. I am also of the opinion that if all the cavalry of this and your department could be moved against Nashville, that the enemy's communications could be utterly broken up." Meanwhile, at Dalton, Johnston was preparing as well. By temperament, Johnston preferred the defensive. His responsibility, as he saw it, was to keep his army together, occupy Sherman's forces so that none could be detached to reinforce the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, and to protect Atlanta. In the spring of 1864, Jefferson Davis prodded Johnston to make some moves against Sherman before he was attacked. Several emissaries were sent from Richmond to assess the condition of the Army of Tennessee and demand offensive action. And there was a wasp in the ranks, John Bell Hood, who commanded a corps in Johnston's army. On April 13th, Hood wrote a private letter, which was no doubt seen by Jefferson Davis, and said, "I have done all in my power to induce General Johnston to accept the proposition you made to move forward. He will not consent. I regret this exceedingly, as my heart was fixed upon our going to the front and regaining Tennessee and Kentucky. When are we to be in better condition to drive the enemy from our country? I'm not able to comprehend. To regain Tennessee would be of more value than half a dozen victories in Virginia." But Johnston preferred to wait in his prepared defenses until Sherman came so close that he could not be missed. On the same day that Grant began his campaign in the East, Sherman ordered his army to move against the Army of Tennessee at Dalton. The terrain of northwest Georgia was a formidable barrier of its own, with high, steep, rocky ridges and few traversable gaps. Johnston, of course, fortified these gaps and kept pickets along the ridgeline. It was clear to everyone that the Union would need to attack Johnston's flanks. A campaign of maneuver and reconnaissance in force kept Johnston guessing and Sherman applying pressure until the Army of Tennessee was forced from its Dalton stronghold. While the armies of the Cumberland and the Ohio pressured Johnston's front and right, the Army of the Tennessee, General Sherman's old unit, now led by James B. McPherson, was tasked with crossing the mountains well south of Rocky Face to threaten the Confederate rear, and if possible, to cut the railroad and telegraph somewhere near the Oostenaula River, which is that crooked thing down there at the bottom. The Army of the Tennessee considered themselves the best fighting unit in the entire Union force. But their commander was new to his job, and McPherson's lack of experience was costly. By May 9th, the vanguard of the Army was through Snake Creek Gap, which is shown there on the map. And McPherson sent cavalry to provide intelligence on the rebels' strength at Resaca and to disturb the rail and telegraph lines if he were able. The amount of resistance they felt and the information McPherson got from his scouts caused him to hesitate and pull back to the mouth of Snake Creek Gap. In fact, there were only 2 Confederate brigades at Resaca. An immediate attack could have trapped Johnston's forces and left Atlanta totally unprotected. The reprieve McPherson allowed gave Johnston the time to move to his south and Leonidas Polk to come up north from Rome, Georgia, to reinforce Resaca. Sherman, meanwhile, moved all of his troops through Snake Creek Gap. When he met with McPherson, Sherman said, "Well, Mac, you missed the opportunity of your life." While the Union armies probed the Resaca defenses, McPherson's troops were dispatched south again to threaten the railroad closer to Atlanta. Skillfully disengaging at Resaca and holding the inside line, Johnston was able to slow down the Union advance at Cassville. As Johnston's army retreated, refugees fled ahead of them, some to Atlanta, others to rural South Georgia. Nearly the whole population is moving off and taking their Negroes south, wrote one Georgian. There will scarcely be any provisions raised about here this year, which will seriously affect us another year, whether the war continues or not. A quartermaster clerk with Johnston's wagon train told his diary, "This morning, when the train was passing the house of a farmer, a lady gave the men all the milk, butter, and buttermilk that she had. They were not satisfied with this. They took all the chickens she had, robbed all the nests they could find, went to the stables and took all the fodder, and not content with this, pulled down the fences and turned their horses in upon fields of wheat. I'm sorry to say this has been the case all along the road by our army." This is the Southern Army, remember. In 12 days, and with roughly 3,500 casualties, Sherman's forces were halfway to Atlanta. Their railroad supply line to Chattanooga was now 80 miles long, and Sherman was concerned that as he posted infantry detachments to guard the railroad, he was reducing his army strength, while the retreating rebels were concentrating and increasing their strength. He called in the scattered regiments of his three armies from Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, and Alabama, and asked the War Department to back us up with troops in the rear, so I will not be forced to drop detachments as road guards and have an army that will make a deep hole in the Confederacy. With the addition of Polk's division, Joe Johnston was now in command of the largest Confederate army ever assembled in the West, about 70,000 troops. He concentrated most of his force near Cassville and waited for Sherman to arrive. But his position there was less defensible than Johnston thought, and by May 20th, the rebel army was retreating toward the southeast and into the mountains again. That day, General Johnston received a telegram from Jefferson Davis that read, "Your dispatch of the 16th, announcing the retreat from Resaca, received. Read with disappointment. I hope the reinforcements sent will enable you to achieve important results." The political pressure was mounting, along with the military strain. After a few days of rest, with wounded sent to the rear and supplies brought to the front, both armies began to move again. In his broadest flanking move yet, Sherman abandoned the railroad entirely and swept his three armies south, expecting to cross the mountains without a challenge, believing Johnston would make a stand at Marietta. With intelligence from his far superior cavalry and the inside path, Johnston was able to intercept the advancing Union force on May 25th at Dallas and New Hope Church. What followed was 3 days of confusion in some of the toughest terrain Sherman's army had ever encountered. And by moving away from the railroad into a Georgia wilderness where there were no roads of any consequence, quartermasters were having a difficult time supplying the army with food and fodder. Meanwhile, Johnston's natural caution convinced him to forego several possible angles of attack. In several places along the front, the main lines were only a few hundred yards apart, but the armies were virtually invisible to one another because of the thick forest canopy and dense undergrowth. Movement was difficult, and skirmishers often fired blindly toward enemy gunfire. Though there was no large-scale assault or flanking movement, there was plenty of fighting, with neither side gaining much ground. Finally, at the end of the month, Sherman pulled out of Dallas and moved northeast, back toward the railroad, and Johnston, except for some brief skirmishing, didn't challenge him. Early in the morning of June the 2nd, it began to rain, and it rained every one of the next 12 days. Yeah, think back to June. Roads became quagmires, trenches filled with water, and it became even more difficult to locate the enemy. In a letter to his brother, one Union soldier said, "This is the severest campaign this army ever had." Another told his parents, "It's awful hard soldiering up here and takes a right stout man to stand it." On June 14th, the rain finally stopped and skies cleared, and the commanders of both armies took advantage of the weather to inspect their positions and assess those of the enemy. While reviewing the Army of the Cumberland at the base of Pine Mountain, Sherman noticed a group of Confederate officers watching them from the top of the hill. He ordered an immediate artillery volley to force the rebels to take cover. On the hilltop were General William J. Hardee, commander of the forces occupying that position, and Generals Johnston and Polk, who had come to evaluate the strength of the Union troops below them. They soon learned the location and accuracy of the enemy's artillery. 3 volumes in quick succession scattered the high command of the Army of Tennessee, and a solid shot hit General Polk, killing him instantly. Leonidas Polk commanded the First Corps of the Army of Tennessee and was generally seen as, at best, a reasonably competent commander. But he was also an ordained Episcopal bishop and the Southern Army's spiritual leader. A fellow officer said every private soldier loved him. Second to Stonewall Jackson, his loss was the greatest the South ever sustained. In a letter to his wife on June 26, Sherman wrote, "My lines are 10 miles long, and every change necessitates a large amount of work. Still, we are now ready, and I must attack, direct, or turn the position tomorrow. I will pitch in at 1 or 2 points." Across the lines, Confederate General Hardee wrote to his wife the same day, "My lines are strong, and I feel perfectly confident of whipping the Yankees whenever and whosoever they come." Sherman decided to feign on both flanks and assault the center. It was the first time in the whole campaign that he chose a direct frontal assault, and it failed utterly. The temperature that neared 100 degrees exhausted the soldiers quickly and dehydrated them. By mid-afternoon, Sherman recognized the failure and called off the attack. He had lost 3,000 killed and wounded, the largest single-day casualty count of the campaign so far. The Chattahoochee River flows northeast to southwest 8 miles from Atlanta. General Johnston told a senator who visited his headquarters on July the 1st that he could hold Sherman north of the Chattahoochee for 2 months. By the time President Davis received this assurance on July the 10th, the Yankees had crossed the river. Once again, Sherman counted on the incredibly nimble Army of the Tennessee. McPherson's men again flanked to the Confederate left, forcing them back to the banks of the river. Then they embarked on a wide sweeping movement to the right, with the armies of the Cumberland and the Ohio crossing the river inside their path. Johnston pulled back to the outside ring of fortifications around Atlanta, near Peachtree Creek. When the campaign began 75 days and 100 miles ago, both Sherman and Johnston understood the political significance of their missions. The Confederacy's political and military leaders recognized that they could not defeat the Union on the battlefield. They were too small and too isolated to withstand the pressure of the Northern armies. But they firmly believed that if they could hold on through the summer, they could change the political mood in the North, and a war-weary populace would elect a Democrat willing to sue for peace. Johnston's tactics of parry and retreat had his troops on the outskirts of Atlanta. But people in the city and in the Southern press still saw him as a staunch defender who would never allow the city to be taken. No one could question Sherman's fundamental success in Georgia. He was, after all, just 8 miles from Atlanta. But his campaign had not produced a spectacular victory. Instead, there was incremental progress and a growing casualty list. Combined with Grant's massive losses and failure to threaten Richmond, the military situation did not seem hopeful to most people in the North. The Republicans, who renamed themselves the National Union Party, held their convention the second week of June, while Sherman's forces were struggling in the rain near Kennesaw Mountain. Lincoln was nominated for a second term, not because he was unanimously respected, but because the delegates knew that it wasn't wise to change horses in the middle of the stream. The platform's strongest plank declared the party's unconditional commitment to the war and to emancipation. It said, resolved, that as slavery was the cause and now constitutes the strength of this rebellion, we demand its utter and complete extirpation from the soil of the Republic. We are in favor, furthermore, of a constitutional amendment to forever prohibit the existence of slavery in the United States. So, to vote for Lincoln and the Republicans was to vote to continue the war until the South surrendered unconditionally. The Democrats, watching Lincoln's popularity sag, decided to postpone their convention. As long as the bad news from the battlefields continued, the Democrats got stronger and stronger. In Richmond, faith in General Johnston's leadership was faltering. As Sherman's forces crossed the Chattahoochee, President Davis sent his chief of staff, General Braxton Bragg, to assess the situation near Atlanta. Bragg had left Georgia 6 months earlier in complete and utter disgrace after the debacle at Missionary Ridge. Now he was back to evaluate the fitness of the man who had replaced him as commander of the Army of Tennessee. Bragg met with Johnston, but also with General Hood, one of Johnston's corps commanders who had spoken out on a number of occasions, questioning Johnston's strategies and tactics. John Bell Hood is a fascinating character. In 1864, he was a 33-year-old lieutenant general, a West Point graduate, and a veteran of 2nd Manassas, Antietam, Gettysburg, where he lost the use of his left arm from a shrapnel injury, and Chickamauga, where his right leg was amputated after his thigh bone was shattered by a minie ball. Yeah. And he was still in the Army and still on horseback. Need a little help getting there. Almost always successful in combat, he was supremely confident of his own abilities. As Johnston continually fell backward toward Atlanta, Hood made it well known in Richmond that while he would loyally follow his commander's orders, he did not agree with them or approve Johnston's seeming passivity. The Army of Tennessee, he felt, needed to attack fearlessly, even recklessly, if Atlanta was to be protected and Sherman was to be defeated. Jefferson Davis heard the advice from Bragg and Hood, but also consulted with Robert E. Lee at Petersburg. Lee believed that Hood was too reckless. All lion, said Lee of him, none of the fox. Davis decided to give Johnston one last chance. On July 16th, he telegraphed the general a request for your plan of operations. Johnston replied that his plan, quote, must depend upon that of the enemy. We are trying to put Atlanta in condition to be held by the Georgia militia so that the Army movements may be freer and wider. This hint of an intention to give up Atlanta was the final straw. The next day, 33-year-old Hood replaced Johnston. On July 19th, his first day in command, Hood assessed his situation. He had between 55,000 and 60,000 effective troops, including cavalry and local militia. It was the Confederacy's largest army. They ranged in a line that stretched from the railroad bridge where Peachtree Creek met the Chattahoochee River east to just beyond Peachtree Road, which on the map is that straight north-south line through the middle. That's Peachtree Road. According to his intelligence, Thomas's Army of the Cumberland was beginning to move south across Peachtree Creek, while Schofield and McPherson were moving to the east toward Decatur. Based on this information, Hood saw an opportunity. He could strike Thomas's army before it could entrench on the south bank of the creek, forcing it back to the Chattahoochee, where the Army of the Cumberland would be trapped. He could then turn his attention to the armies of the Tennessee and the Ohio, threatening the railroad to the east. But Hood's information was only partly correct. The Army of the Tennessee was already at Decatur and was destroying the Georgia Railroad there. In order to protect his right, Hood shifted his formations to the east and south, a movement that took several hours. During that time, Thomas was able to get his army across the creek and sheltered behind basic earthworks. The assault Hood hoped to begin at 1 o'clock didn't start until after 4. 2 hours and 15 minutes later, Hood called off the battle, recognizing that his opportunity to trap the Army of the Cumberland was lost. Thomas's defense cost him 1,710 killed and wounded. Hood's losses on attack were 4,796, with no real gain on the battlefield. Meanwhile, moving west from Decatur, the Army of the Tennessee threatened the Confederate right. Around mid-afternoon, General John A. Logan's artillery reached a high point about 2.5 miles from Atlanta and fired the first shots into the city. The shells exploded in the giant square in front of City Hall and at the car shed, the railroad depot. July 21st was a blisteringly hot day. During the morning, Union troops captured Bald Hill, the end of a ridge that crossed the Decatur Road. For the rest of the day, the Confederates tried to take it back in what General Claiborne called the bitterest fighting he had ever experienced. And those troops of the Army of the Tennessee not occupied at Bald Hill spent the day destroying the Georgia Railroad, pulling up and burning ties and twisting rails around telegraph poles in what soldiers called Sherman's neckties. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Hood planned for his next assault. Since his frontal attack on Thomas's forces had failed, he looked for other vulnerabilities in the Union line. One was a gap between Thomas's Army of the Cumberland and Schofield's Army of the Ohio, where he, along with McPherson's Army of the Tennessee, could threaten Hood's last lifeline, the railroad south of the city. Driving a wedge through that gap could push Thomas back to the Chattahoochee, but Hood decided that he needed to address the threat from the Army of the Tennessee, that threatened the Georgia Railroad. So he devised an audacious plan to move his forces south and east overnight in the most ambitious flanking maneuver attempted by either army during the campaign. So his plan was take all those, most of those units that were facing Thomas north of the city, bring them through the city, out the south side, and on this big looping path to the south and then east to meet the Army of the Tennessee where it was working busily on the Georgia Railroad there. Which brings us finally to the Battle of Atlanta. Hood's goal was not to trap and destroy the Army of the Tennessee, but to surprise it and roll it up to the north where successive rebel units could pick up the attack and continue to force the whole from the Confederate right to left down Peachtree Creek. For the plan to work, General Hardee's Infantry Corps and Wheeler's cavalry needed to be in position to attack at dawn, which meant an overnight march of up to 15 miles. Some of Hardee's troops were 3 miles north of Atlanta facing the Army of the Cumberland, so 18. Hardee realized that reaching Decatur in order to attack McPherson's rear at dawn was impossible for his infantry. He insisted that an attack on the Union flank by his troops, while Wheeler's cavalry continued to Decatur, would be as effective, and it would cut down the miles his men would need to travel overnight. It was a clear night with a waning moon, but darkness and dust slowed the march to about 1.5 miles an hour. When the vanguard reached Cobb's Mill, the southern point of the flanking maneuver, the Army stretched 8 miles long, with the last units just outside Atlanta's defenses. By dawn, the troops at the front had covered 13 miles, and the morning light revealed that the rebel forces had shrunk considerably. It appears that the combination of thick, deep woods and darkness provided the opportunity for thousands of foot soldiers to fall out of line. At around 11 a.m., Hardee was finally in position to order his 2-mile-long double line forward toward Grenville Dodge's corps. But they had to contend with thick underbrush, briar patches, and a mill pond that was 500 yards wide and a mile long that nobody had told them about. It was really a small lake they needed to get around in order to reform their battle line on the other side. First contact was made about noon at the southernmost point of Dodge's line. It was a complex battlefield. While most of Hardee's troops pressured the east side of the 16th Corps front, Confederate cavalry attacked Decatur northeast of most of McPherson's division. That allowed a significant gap to open up between the 16th and Frank Blair's 17th Corps. General McPherson, who had been watching the action from a knoll behind Dodge's corps, sent messages to Blair and to Logan warning of the opening and ordering the troops to fill that gap. Then McPherson made a fatal mistake. He rode into the gap between the 16th and 17th Corps just as Confederate General Claiborne began an attack on Blair's left flank. A small group of rebels had penetrated the woods, and they encountered McPherson on a wagon road, where they signaled him to surrender. Instead, McPherson tipped his hat, turned his horse, and galloped into the woods and underbrush. A Mississippi corporal named Robert Coleman fired one shot that struck McPherson in the back as he galloped away. A few minutes later, as McPherson drew his last breath, Union troops were able to fill the gap and repulse the enemy. Hardee's attempt to turn the Union flank ended in failure, never reaching closer than 100 yards of Dodge's corps. But it took the life of a general described by his men as the best man in our army. The action of the battle turned northward. The rebels made 2 more attempts to regain Bald Hill in fierce, sometimes hand-to-hand combat. The Union defense of the peak was so tenacious that it's been called Leggett's Hill ever since, for General Mortimer D. Leggett, who led the 3rd Division of the 17th Corps, which defended it all day. At mid-afternoon, between the 2 assaults on Leggett's Hill, the Confederates of Benjamin Cheatham's Corps launched an attack on the gap in the ridge that ran northward from Bald Hill. Through that gap ran the Georgia Railroad and the Decatur Road. Hood apparently saw this as a diversionary move and would hold Logan's 15th Corps in place at the northern end of the Army of the Tennessee's line, unable to reinforce the other units farther south. Confederate soldiers poured through that lightly defended cut, literally reaching the front porch of Sherman's headquarters. Although Hood did not recognize it, the Army of the Tennessee was close to breaking. The opportunity was there for Hood to destroy a major field army, something neither side had accomplished in 3 years of war. Instead of reinforcing his northern diversion, Hood continued to wait for the Union left to collapse under the weight of Hardee's assault. But the Army of the Tennessee was reinforced by the division-sized Army of the Ohio, and they were able, with additional manpower and artillery, to turn the battle once again. Cheatham's Corps was thrown back to the Atlanta defenses. At 10:30 that Friday night, Hood sent a telegram to Richmond. He reported that Hardee's Corps had attacked the enemy's extreme left today at 1 o'clock and drove him from his works, capturing 16 pieces of artillery and 5 stands of colors. That Cheatham attacked the enemy at 4 p.m. with a portion of his command and forced him back, capturing 6 pieces of artillery. That we captured about 2,000 prisoners. That Wheeler's cavalry routed the enemy in the neighborhood of Decatur. And that our loss is not fully ascertained, but the prisoners report McPherson killed. Our troops, it concludes, fought with great gallantry. This put the best possible spin on a very costly day for Hood's army. Sherman's report to Washington read, "Fighting has been severe, and we have lost General McPherson, killed by a shot through the lungs while on a reconnaissance." After expressing hope that the enemy would not threaten them again in the morning, Sherman concluded, "Hood fights his graybacks desperately." At 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, flags of truce were raised and both sides collected their wounded and dead. Hood's Army of Tennessee was almost all back inside the relative safety of Atlanta's defenses. One railroad line, the Macon and Western, remained open to the city, and as many civilians as could fled south on this line. For 3 days, the opposing armies regrouped. General Oliver O. Howard was named to replace McPherson as commander of the Army of the Tennessee. Sherman tested Atlanta's defenses and was told by General Schofield of the Army of the Ohio that the enemy has met me in strong works with a good deal of artillery and men enough to resist assault. While the fortifications were no doubt undermanned, they were formidable, with well-sighted artillery all around the perimeter of the city. There were 53 cannon in a 1.5-mile sector alone. Sherman's men were not in the mood for a frontal assault on the city. By July 27th, the Army of the Tennessee was on the move again, sweeping behind and around the armies of the Ohio and the Cumberland, hoping to cut off the Southern Railroad. Hood, who had expected an attack on the railroad from the east, was able to reposition and entrench troops led by General A.P. Stewart along a dirt track called Lick Skillet Road. I love that name. But instead of staying within those trenches, the rebels, with untested leadership and poor coordination, attacked the Army of the Tennessee. The result was catastrophic. It was Hood's third defeat since he'd taken command of the Army of Tennessee, and probably the most demoralizing. One of Hood's officers, when asked how many troops he had left, answered, "Hood has about enough left to make 2 killings." But a soldier in Logan's 15th Corps told his diary, "I'm tired of seeing such butchery, but if they will charge us that way once a day for a week, this Corps will end the war in this section. We are in excellent spirits and propose to take Atlanta whenever Sherman wants it." Sherman wasn't ready yet. In order to give his troops an opportunity to rest and recover from 2 weeks of near constant marching and combat, and to resupply his army, Sherman launched an artillery attack on the city. On August 4th, a Confederate lieutenant told his sister, "Almost all the shells they throw into the city come screaming just above our heads. Generally, they commence on this fort and then elevate their guns and send the balance into the city. For a while, we exchange shots with them, but where batteries are well protected as ours and the Yankee batteries before us, it's about as much is made of these artillery duels as the sledgehammer makes to the anvil." Atlanta was considerably marked by these enemy shots. In some parts of town, every house had been struck a dozen times. The houses about the foot of Alabama Street are much battered. Civilians, not surprisingly, continued to flee the city. "War is war and not popularity seeking," wrote Sherman. The defiant courage of the Atlantans who stayed raised the spirits of Southerners everywhere. Much of the Confederate press viewed Hood's attacks as victories. The Atlanta Intelligencer, which had left Atlanta, was now published in Macon, predicted that Sherman will suffer the greatest defeat that any Yankee general has suffered during the war. The Yankee forces will disappear before Atlanta before the end of August. The cheering news from Georgia convinced a War Department clerk in Richmond that Sherman's army is doomed. Richmond newspapers exulted that Atlanta is now felt to be safe and Georgia will soon be free from the foe. Everything seems to have changed in that state from the deepest despondency. News of the campaign affected the political climate in the North. Sherman hated reporters and would not allow them near his department. So, a great deal of the news of the Atlanta campaign that reached the North was copied from Southern newspapers. So they heard all that stuff I just said. Yeah, he might have been successful on the battlefield, but voters at home were not seeing that success. What they saw were long casualty lists and Southern claims of victory. While Sherman's losses in Georgia were fewer than Grant's in Virginia, both campaigns seemed to be losing, or at least stalled in place. As Lincoln composed his Blind Memo on August 23rd, the Democrats, who had postponed their convention all summer, decided that the climate was ripe for a peace candidate, and finally met in Chicago. To no one's surprise, they nominated George B. McClellan for president. McClellan, a war Democrat, and of course the former commander of the Army of the Potomac, favored reconciliation with the South based on the status quo ante. Reunion of the states, with slavery still intact in the states that had had it in March of 1861. The Peace Democrats, led by Clement Vallandigham, wrote the party platform demanding an immediate end to hostilities and negotiations with the Confederacy. As the Democrats were writing their peace platform, the guns around Atlanta went silent, and most of Sherman's army disappeared from the trenches near the city. Hood was jubilant, convinced that the Yankees were retreating. In fact, they were moving south to attack Atlanta's only remaining open railroad. On August 30th, Hood sent 2 corps to Jonesboro, 20 miles south of the city. In 2 days of fierce fighting, the badly outnumbered Hood lost about 2,000 men killed, injured, or captured. To avoid being cut off and trapped in the city, Hood evacuated Atlanta on September 1st after destroying everything of military value in the city. The next day, Sherman sent a message to Washington. Atlanta is ours and fairly won. In the spring, Grant had ordered General Sherman to move against Johnston's army, break it up, and get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can against their war resources. The Army of Tennessee was no longer Johnston's, but it still existed. Hood was able to escape Atlanta and regroup, and he would fight another day. Sherman had reached the heart of the Confederacy and crippled its circulation, controlling or destroying all the railroads into Atlanta. And whether a result of Union shelling or Hood's deliberate destruction of the military assets of the city, profound damage was done to the South's war resources. Perhaps even more than Sherman's military success, the Atlanta campaign provided a political victory just when Lincoln and the Republicans needed one. The fall of Atlanta meant that the war could be won. People in the North took heart, and the Democrats' ill-timed peace platform was declared absolutely worthless. A Hillsdale, Michigan newspaper called The Standard had this clever line: "Sherman's capture of Atlanta makes slivers fall from the Chicago platform." The swift and unambiguous change in political attitudes throughout the North was certainly understood south of the Mason-Dixon line. A Southern colonel worried there will be little for the peace party in the North to stand on. After a long and costly struggle, Sherman's success in the Atlanta campaign brought hope to the North, and with it, a renewed commitment to stay the course to final victory. Thank you, folks.